Welcome to Larry the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. And welcome back to Sabbath Sunday. We haven't done a Sabbath Sunday in some time, and so we have a very special Sabbath Sunday here for you today. Darren and I do a Black Sabbath podcast called Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast that I'll link below. And our latest episode is on the album Tear. And in the past, I've done this where I've done excerpts from the podcast, but we had such a good time doing this one that I'm going to be posting the entire podcast. Now, it was very long, so I had to split it into two sections. So what you're going to get in part one is us, or when we discovered the album, our general feelings on the album, a discussion around the album. And then part two, which will come the following Sunday, will be us going track by track through the album. So here's part one. Enjoy Darren and I discussing Black Sabbath's Tear album. Welcome to Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast. I'm your host, John, and I'm here with my co-host, Darren. And on today's episode, we are going to be discussing Black Sabbath's 15th studio album, Tear, released on August 20th, 1990 on IRS Records. The album is not considered a concept album, but it does have a Norse mythology theme that would run through various tracks and on the album cover. Most of the lineup will carry over from the Headless Cross album, with the only new member being Neil Murray on bass, who had joined the band on the Headless Cross tour. Produced by Iommi and Cozy Powell with mixed results, the album would find the band moving even more away from the traditional Sabbath sound of the 70s and early 80s to some fans' displeasure. The failing status of Black Sabbath didn't allow for any U.S. tour dates, but on the shows that were played in Europe, the band played Anno Mundi, Lawmaker, and the Sabbath Stones from the album. Though the album did not sell well, like many of the Martin era albums, Tear has developed a cult following through the years. All right, Darren, what are your memories of hearing Tear for the first time, and your early initial thoughts on it?
It's not really an album that stands out that much for me. I like it. It's not one of my favorites. It's not one I pull out very often, but when I do, it's okay. I mean, I when I do pull it out, I have an urge to listen to it, and I know what to expect from it, so I'm not generally disappointed by it. But as far as getting how I got it, how I found out about it, word of mouth. I mean, at this point, we talked about it with our last podcast with Headless Cross. Black Sabbath is now, they're off Warner Brothers. They're on IRS Metal, which is even like a lower tier of IRS Records, which is essentially an independent record label. I guess you could say a wealthy independent record label, but it's not a major label. So they've gone downhill a bit from the Warner Brothers. But there wasn't a lot of promotion, and I don't really recall seeing any magazine ads. But I did hear some people talking about it, and they were talking about how much they liked it, how good it was, and so my curiosity was piqued. I would have gotten it anyway because it's a new Black Sabbath album, but a little bit more enthusiasm was involved because I heard that it was a really good album. And so I got it, and I was living in a city at the time, and I was within walking distance to Tower Records. So I went down, and sure enough, it was on sale, and I got it. I took it home, I listened to it, and I thought it was fine. It was good. But at this point, I, having already heard Eternal Idol, Headless Cross, I wasn't taken off guard by what I heard. I knew what to expect. I was actually pretty pleased with the production for what it is. I thought it was an improvement over Headless Cross. I thought the songs were better. I still do personally think the songs are better. And insofar as this era of the band, and you have to sort of compartmentalize it. I mean, it's not really fair to talk about it completely in the same context as everything that came before, where you had the Ozzy era, you had the Dio era, and then you had Born Again. And then you could pretty much say that this era more or less started with Seven Star. From there, Eternal Idol, Headless Cross, and now here we are at Tear. And this would be the last one before things shift again. But when you talk about this as Black Sabbath, it's helpful. It helps me understand it. It helps me organize my thoughts about these records if I look at them as a separate entity. Um, I think it would have been better if, and you've mentioned this numerous times, you thought it would be a better decision if the band went by, say, Headless Cross. And I agree. And I think if, or even just like a Tony Iommi solo band, because if they were to do that, it would be unfair to constantly make comparisons with previous material, previous singers, or previous albums. It would be unfair to do that because it's not called Black Sabbath. But when you have the audacity to call it Black Sabbath, it begs to be compared to everything that came before, and that's a real hard position for this band to be in at this time. Now, there was a lot of things going on musically in and around this era that are also creating a lot of challenges too. I mean, things are it's sort of like the tail end of the glam era, and we're moving into grunge. As far as like I guess what you could consider mainstream music at the time, bubbling up from the underground, we had death metal. There was death metal was really starting to come up. Swedish death metal, Florida death metal was starting to rear its head, and it was exciting. It was new. So this was kind of an awkward place. 1990 was an awkward time for a record like this to come out. It was sort of the old guard, and it didn't offer. I mean, it didn't offer a lot of excitement for a younger age group. It wasn't extreme. It was sort of. I love British rock. I love blues rock. I love Gary Moore, Michael Schenker Group, early Whitesnake, all that stuff. I did then too. But I think that at the time that it came out, it had gotten a little bit stale, and the material on this album, as well as the two predecessors, you might even say it's three preceding records, probably hung a little too long in that genre, and it just really wasn't that relevant in 1990 anymore. So I think that was another challenge. But having said all that, based on its own uh, quality, I think it's good. I like Cozy Powell more on this album. I can hear more of Cozy's influence. I think he brings some of a Rainbow. His involvement with Rainbow kind of lands here in a couple places. I appreciate that. I think Tony's guitar tone is a little bit better overall than it was on Headless Cross for me. The keyboards are a little bit more subdued. They're not in the forefront of the mix like they were in Headless Cross, with the exception of one or two songs where it's intended for them to be front and center. But it's not saturated with keyboards in every song, and the keyboards aren't running neck and neck with the guitar, which was one of the issues I had with Headless Cross. So I'm going to say that I considered it an improvement. I didn't have any ill will towards this album the way that I had with Headless Cross, and I guess I really haven't changed my perspective on it. I still feel pretty much the same. It's a good album. It's not excellent. It's not bad. It's good. I like it. So.
This is an interesting Black Sabbath album for me. I can pretty much remember buying every Sabbath album, but I can't for the life of me remember when I bought this one. I remember when I heard it for the first time and found out about it. When we did our Bill Ward Ward 1 along the way, I mentioned that my girlfriend at the time, my current wife, was a DJ, had a metal show at our local college. And the guy that ran one of the guys that ran the station and ran the metal night, he gave me a copy of the Bill Ward album. And I can remember him telling me oh, hey, Black Sabbath has a new album, Tear. It's really, really good. And it's like, wow, okay. Now I don't remember if he gave me a cassette copy of it or if I just went out and bought the cassette myself, but I got it, right after this gentleman recommended it to me, and I liked it when I first heard it. I liked it a lot. I remember thinking that Tony Martin really seemed to be the star on this album. There's a lot of layered vocals. Tony's melody lines are really great. His voice is right there in the mix. It's very powerful. I also remember kind of feeling like I really liked Headless Cross, and I was really into Headless Cross. This album came pretty quickly, relative to the way Black Sabbath was operating at this time. Headless Cross was 89. This came out in 90. So I think it was a little over a year between those two records. So it felt like Tear came around rather quickly, which was nice. Tony Martin, 3 albums in at this point. Cozy Powell, his second album. It was starting to feel like there's some consistency here. Uh, at the time, I liked the production on the record. I think it hasn't aged as well for me. I find it now to be too reverbed out, and the guitar is not as crunchy and present in the mix as I would like it to be on a Black Sabbath record. But at the time, it felt like it was very modern, like it was right there. Again, you referenced this, Darren, what was going on in 1989, 1990. We're at the end of the hair metal stuff. Stuff is very slick at this point. I mean, Bon Jovi and Whitesnake are releasing these huge, very big production albums that have this really glossy, slick kind of sound to it. And I remember thinking that Tear kind of felt like it fit in with that. It didn't feel out of place to me with what else was going on at the time. My complaint with the record would be, although again, at the time when I heard it, I liked it. I thought that there were a lot of really catchy melodies. I remember really being excited with the opening track, Anno Monday, with those layered vocals and everything. Uh, but it kind of went, it slipped from my mind kind of quickly. Like I kind of just forgot about it. I never really paid much attention to it. And as the years go by, even to this day, I find myself, when it comes to Tony Martin, I find myself in a Tony Martin mood where all I'm listening to is the Tony Martin era albums. And I think that plays into what you were talking about how you kind of have to think of this era of the band as its own thing. And like you mentioned, and I've said it, I think the band would have been better served to have taken on a different band name, because then you wouldn't have had these comparisons to the old Black Sabbath. And I understand why there's some people that cannot embrace this era of the band, because they have, if you had somebody that had only ever listened to the Ozzy and the Dio era of the band and never knew anything about this, and you just randomly dropped this in and played this for them, they would think it was just some British, European, late 80s, early power metal band or something. You
Yeah.
probably wouldn't even have known that it was Black Sabbath. So I understand why there's some people that can't embrace this era of the band. And now we've moved into, and this is the other thing too. I felt like with Headless Cross and Tear, it felt like there was some consistency between those two records. Seven Star to Eternal, Born Again to Seven Star, no consistency in the lineup or the sound. Seven Star to Eternal Idol, no consistency. Eternal Idol, the Headless Cross, the connection with Tony Martin. But to me, those albums feel different to me. When we talked about the Eternal Idol, I mentioned that felt like the last Black Sabbath album I could tie back to any previous era of the band. But Headless Cross and Tear, I always think of them as a pair because sonically and musically, for me, they feel similar. But going back to my other point, I understand why people have trouble embracing this era of the band, because it is so different. And you can say in one respect, like you said, and like I said, you have to kind of compartmentalize this and view it as its own entity. But the counter to that is that this is Black Sabbath. And when you have a band that has a history and has released as many albums as they have, as many classic albums as they have, to have something that sounds this different, it's almost like false advertising in some ways.
Yeah.
I use the example of a movie franchise. You go to see a Star Wars movie, you're expecting sci-fi and spaceships and lasers and a certain feel and everything and the way the movie works. If you went to a Star Wars movie and the movie was a Western, you'd be confused. And even if it was an awesome Western movie, you would still be confused because the name of the franchise is Star Wars. And that's kind of what's going on here. It's a good album. Even though I have complaints about the amount of reverb on it, it's a fairly well produced record. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of good songs here. There's a lot of good playing and everything. But you sort of can't get past the fact that it says Black Sabbath at the top, and it has moved so far away from where this band had originally started. The other thing is that looking now in the future, of course, at the time when Tear came out, nobody knew this. I'm sitting there thinking like, oh, okay, we finally have some consistency in the band. I can finally like reinvest put my heart into this band again. You know, when Ian Gillan was in the band, I thought, okay, but when Dio was in the band, all of a sudden Dio's gone. Then Ian Gillan, I put my heart into that band. He only lasts for one record. Seven Stars shows up with Glenn Hughes. He only lasts for one record. Eternal Idol, completely different band going into Headless Cross, except for Tony Martin and Tony. So you put your heart into this and you feel like you get cheated on. You get it's pulled over on you every time, like just when you start to emotionally get invested in the band. So that's the way I felt here. Like, okay, now there's some consistency. I can really start embracing this era of the band again. And of course, as we all know now, looking back in history, they would abandon this and Tony would go back to with Dio. Love Dio, love Dehumanizer. We'll get into that when we talk about Dehumanizer. But again, this inconsistency thing, and maybe if the band had stuck with this, if there was Headless Cross, Tear, and 3-4 more albums that kind of continued along this road, this sound, this direction, you might have been able to say, well, heck, yeah, it doesn't sound like early Black Sabbath, but hey, they released 6 albums in this style, and it's just the new era of the band. There's plenty of bands that have super long histories that have changed. Genesis, Peter Gabriel to the Phil Collins era, Jethro Tull, the 70s and 80s Jethro Tulls are sort of different beasts. So there's a lot of bands that have long careers that do that. And if they had continued with this sound, maybe it would be a little bit easier to embrace. But when you look back in history, you kind of feel like maybe they didn't know what they weren't 100% sure, trying these different things. And when it didn't work, they jump ship and they go back to Dio. And then they're back with Tony Martin and everything. So it's a confusing era for me. I have mixed feelings about it. When I put the album on, I do enjoy it. There are a lot of great songs on it. But then there's other times where I get slightly annoyed by the record because it is such a shift from what Black Sabbath was all about. And I can't help at times think about what has come before. And let's face it, Black Sabbath isn't like Deep Purple Mark II, where Mark I had some success and everything. But, Mark II, I mean, the early era of Black Sabbath, there's so many classic milestone, great records that's a hard legacy to live up to, so it's easy to understand that the standard is set very, very high. Again, going back to a movie reference, the original Star Wars movie, the original Godfather series, these are classic very high standards. And that's the way I look at Black Sabbath, that they have albums that are such great albums of such a high standard that when you have an album like Tear, that even though it's a good album, it's a really good album, it still feels like it falls short because of the illustrious history of the band that has come before this, especially the Ozzy and the Dio era. So, an album of mixed feelings for me. Uh, a love-hate relationship I kind of have with this album, but it's an interesting one, and there's a lot, there is a lot of good things going on with it, but I understand why some people can't embrace this.
When you said it sometimes makes you angry, I get that feeling too from this, because it feels to me like calling it Black Sabbath is disingenuous. It's a marketing tool um, that misrepresents the music on these records. And I think when a band gets down to there only being one original member, I think in fairness, there has to be an evaluation made as far as, okay, so there's no other original members of the band, but does it at least have the same qualities as the previous records with the original lineup? Is there some consistency? And if the answer is no, and invariably it will almost always be no, because when you take these principal players out, you take, when we're talking about Black Sabbath, you take Geezer out, you not only take his bass playing, and you take his lyrics out of the equation. You take Bill Ward out, and Bill Ward's been, this is not just something new here with the absence of Bill Ward. Um, at this point, after Never Say Die, Bill's been in and out a couple times, a few times, let's say. But Bill's contribution to the classic Sabbath sound was profound. So you're not only, you're doing this without Geezer, you're doing it without Bill, and you now have a different singer, and the singers have always characterized the eras of this band. Whether you want to talk about the material on the album changing, the sound of the music changing, that's true, that's valid. But more than anything else, I think the one thing that really is the most remarkable when you're talking about the different eras of the band is the singer. The Ozzy era is its thing for 8 records, and then Dio joins, and then everything shifts. It becomes, they reinvented themselves. It becomes epic. It's great. And we've talked about it on previous podcasts. When things started to wind down in 1978, Dio came in, took control, steered the band in a brand new direction. It was the right time. It was the right statement to make, and it worked really well. But nevertheless, you still had Bill, you had Geezer, so you had everybody. You had the main personnel of the band was still intact. You fast forward to 1989 or 86, 87. You only have Tony Iommi, so it's not really fair to call it Black Sabbath. And the music, of course, it doesn't sound the same. So when I say it's disingenuous and it's a marketing ploy, I think it is that. And unfortunately, it backfired because I think that they did themselves a disservice. I know it would have been somewhat of an uphill battle, maybe to completely reinvent this band and go out into the wilderness of the music industry with a new band name. But I think in the end, it may have served them better, because I think ultimately what was their demise was that it just didn't hold up to the legacy of Black Sabbath, and I think a lot of people rejected it. There's a lot of people that liked these records. Headless Cross is a huge fan base
Yeah.
for Headless Cross, and I was kind of surprised when I guess I first noticed that about 10 years or so ago. I was really kind of taken back by it. Now I'm used to it. Now that I know whenever there's a discussion about Headless Cross, or on social media somebody posts the album cover and it's the anniversary, or there's some event that triggers a celebration of Headless Cross, there's going to be a string of comments about people. This is the best Black Sabbath album, my favorite Black Sabbath album. But a lot of times, those are people that are making those comments are the ones who came into that was their first Black Sabbath album. There's probably exceptions to that, but I very rarely see anybody once you maybe you scroll down a little bit or you start to follow the comments and you put it together, who's saying what and is how is this person defending their stance on it. Very rarely is it somebody who said, well, I originally got into Black Sabbath during the Ozzy era, but Headless Cross is my favorite. Very rarely, if ever, will you. I don't think I've ever seen anybody say that. More often than not, the people that like Tear, the people that like Headless Cross or Eternal Idol, or moving forward into well, actually moving backward now, you could say um, the Dio era. Some people will hold that as their favorite, and that's when they came into it, and I get that. And likewise with Headless Cross and Tear and Eternal Idol, when this was their entry level, when this is their entry point, this is what they had the fondest memories of this era, and everything else gets compared to this because this is the first thing they heard. So that's why there is a fondness for this album. But by and large, I think most of the people that were there before this happened do not like it. I know that we've noticed when we've done some Sabbath Sunday videos and we were talking about what we liked about the Tony Martin era, what are our favorite songs from the Tony Martin era, what are our
Yeah.
least favorite songs from the Tony Martin era. I think we even did a show talking about the Tony Martin box set, and there was comments on those videos about people that just hated it.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess it's a polarizing time in the band's history, but this is where we are. We've made it all the way up to here. And for better for worse, in the history of things, it's a Black Sabbath album. So,
I
yeah,
guess for me, what is difficult with this era of the band is this is the only time where I feel like Black Sabbath doesn't stand out. I discovered Sabbath in 1980. But even looking back on the 70s, there's none of their peers sound like Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath does not sound
absolutely right.
anything like Deep Purple or Uriah Heep or
Yep.
UFO or something like that. Even during the Dio era, I think that they're kind of head and shoulders above a lot of the competition. And even the people that were on the same level as them, like Judas Priest or something, they still don't sound like
Yep.
anybody else. They have a very strong identity, their own thing going on. Even Born Again, when Born Again came out, I didn't think there was anything else that sounded like that. It wasn't like I heard
Yep.
Born Again and was like, oh, this just sounds like everything else going on right now. Let's put Seven Star aside, but even Seven Star, Glenn Hughes, he's such an amazing singer and such a unique voice in everything. And in some ways, it felt like a little bit of a throwback record because of the bluesy influence and stuff on Seven Star. But with Headless Cross and Tear, it starts to sound like a lot of other bands at that time. And I mentioned the production earlier about how initially I felt like, yeah, it fit right in with the times, what was happening at that time. It also caused it to sort of blend into the wallpaper. This album and Headless Cross too, they they don't sound as unique. They're starting to sound like other bands around them, especially by this point when we're talking 88, 89, and where metal is at in general. And they're starting to even sound dated at this point because now we're fully into the thrash metal thing. Grunge is right around the corner. Some of the early Soundgarden's already out there. It's starting to it whereas they always had their own thing and always stood out. They were very unique. These albums don't sound as unique. And that doesn't mean they're not good. That doesn't mean there aren't good songs on them and good playing and everything. And hey, any any day with Tony Iommi is a good day, listening to Tony Iommi riff out and everything. I'll take that over a lot of other bands, but you just can't help but kind of feel like that they've just become sort of another band, and they get a little lost in the pack. They get lost in the shuffle. This is 1990. There's so much stuff going on right now. And the proof of that is that the sales of this album were pretty terrible. They weren't even able to tour the US on this record. I don't remember seeing any videos for it on MTV. I mean, I don't remember reading about it in the magazines either. I mean, they were pretty much, they didn't really do anything that made them stand out. And maybe the thing to do at this point, I mean, I don't know what that direction would have been, but maybe if they had reestablished their sound, even if it was I guess I'm saying it thinking like this, this is different than the earlier Black Sabbath, but the problem is that it sounds too much like other bands that are going.
I agree. Yeah, I know.
If it was its own, like if it was a different
Yeah.
direction, but it was this unique different direction, it's like, oh wow, they've carved out their own little corner here
Yeah.
in what's going on in 1990. And even though you say, well, this doesn't sound anything like the Ozzy era or the Dio era, but they've carved out their own unique space, and they've reinvented
Yep.
themselves in this new thing. And only Black Sabbath can I'm trying to think of bands that have really reinvented their sound and become like a new thing. And I think that would have worked better. Instead, the direction that they took, and again, it starts with Headless Cross, the kind of generic lyrics on Bats and Devils lyrics on Headless Cross. And it kind of continues on here, like the Norse mythology thing. I mean, it's certainly beaten to death in 20 to 23. I remember even in 1990 kind of feeling like it was a little bit like, okay, this is kind of like a lot of people do this. It's not really, didn't really jump out at me as
Yeah.
anything really like mind blowing and unique. And maybe that's where the misstep was with this band. They should have tried to do something more unique rather than kind of going in this direction that made them feel like they were followers instead of leaders in some ways. There's moments on this record that, Black Sabbath never felt like a band that was really paying a lot of attention to what else was going on. They just did
Yeah.
their own thing, and they did it really well. Well, here it
Yeah.
kind of feels like they're sort of looking around the room like, hey, maybe we should try this because this is kind of working. And have you heard the new Blue Murder record? Have you heard the new White Snake album? Maybe we should go in that kind of direction. And it's
Yeah.
just not something when it comes to Black Sabbath, a band that I hold in very high esteem with an immense amount of respect because of their unique individuality and the music that they've put out. To have them kind of in this position where they're uh, walking amongst the mere mortals is
Yeah.
it doesn't feel right to me. And it just
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's an excellent point. I had also thought about that too. You're right, 100%. This era is marred by the fact that it just blends into the background, and there is no other time, and up to this point, where Black Sabbath's music was mediocre, or it wasn't profound, or it didn't have such a strong identity. The identity of the band in this era was very subdued. And you say, well, what would they have? What should they have done? How could they have changed that? Well, I mean, you basically you had Tony Iommi and hired guns. Now the lineup was consistent insofar as the touring lineup for Headless Cross is now the main band in on this album. We had Neil Murray, Cozy Powell, um, and so and Jeff Nichols is back on keyboards. So you have a consistent lineup, but you've got Neil Murray, and Neil Murray is like a veteran of the British rock scene. I don't know that he has nothing against Neil Murray. He's a fantastic player, but does he have the personality to bring to a band that's going to make that band sound unique, that's going to not make it blend in with everything else that Neil Murray's done, that's not going to make Black Sabbath turn into Whitesnake, which is what I think a lot of the songs on Headless Cross sound like. Maybe not so much with Tear, but I do get a Whitesnake vibe from Headless Cross. And likewise, you had Cozy Powell, who's been, he's hopped around quite a bit himself, uh, and was also on in Whitesnake at one point. So you have half the slided in lineup of Whitesnake in this band, and it's hard when you're talking about what would have made this era stronger, what would have given it the same kind of identity when you're talking about you're changing from a well-established band from 1969 to 1978 with the Ozzy era, and you have a new singer. But wow, what a transformation, what a strong presence that band had from that point on. And you're talking about a great producer. Tear and Hell's Cross, I think, were both produced by Tony Iommi and Cozy Powell. But when you're talking about Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules, you're talking about Martin Birch getting, really involved with the production end of it. So the sound of the record was very profound. You had Ronnie James Dio, of course, who was in Rainbow, but he tailored his sound, his style to suit Black Sabbath. Same thing with Ian Gillan. Ian Gillan, of course, had a long tenure with Deep Purple, but when he joined Sabbath, there was a certain side to him that became unique and fit in so well with Black Sabbath. These players weren't, either they weren't capable of, or they weren't in the headspace of doing that. They were bringing their credentials, their repertoire, their resumes to the table and producing music in a familiar way, which didn't give this band its own identity, its own profound personality. And I think that's what the point you were trying to make. At least that's what I was thinking while
Yeah.
you were referring to previous eras as being so strong, and there was nobody else that sounded like Black Sabbath. There was nobody that was as heavy as Black Sabbath up until this point. We got here, and you could arguably say, well, they sound kind of like Whitesnake. There's a little bit of Bon Jovi here. There's definitely some Blue Murder. There might even be some Def Leppard going on in here too. So the once mighty Black Sabbath has now just kind of like been diluted, and that's where we are with Tear. And I'm not to get ahead of ourselves, but they realized this at the time. At least Tony Iommi realized it when they couldn't tour North America and the sales weren't
Yeah.
good. I mean, they knew that something had to happen if they were to be able to sustain themselves and for a career in music, because it was not doing well. However, I don't know. There's another point that you made earlier on that I'm going to agree with too. If they had stuck it out, if they had some commitment, maybe if they had a better management, somebody to direct them in a more a better promotional way, they could have sold this lineup a little bit better. Maybe, I don't know, maybe gotten a different bass player, maybe gotten Geezer back. I mean, again, not to foreshadow anything, but that I think is something that happened or will happen in the future that made a big difference. And it might had it happened the way that it should have, and Geezer was available. If the timing was right and Geezer was available to join the band at this time, they probably would have. But unfortunately, it was too late, and Geezer had already committed to being part of Ozzy's band. But I think it might have made a big difference if Geezer was in this band, and it might have pulled them back into something with a little bit more semblance to the classic era of Black Sabbath. But we don't have the advantage of that. What we have is Neil Murray, Cozy Powell, Tony Iommi, and Jeff Nichols, and this is a product of that lineup, and you know, it's
Yeah.
pretty good.
I'm glad you made the point about bringing up the members of the band and the personalities. Maybe these weren't the right personalities for the band. Even Cozy Powell. I love Cozy Powell. I think he's an amazing drummer. but maybe they would have been better served to do something like what Judas Priest did with Painkiller, bringing in Scott Travis, he was in Racer X, but he was basically a young guy, relatively unknown, but that had he he had the modern chops. You know, he was like a younger guy that was in tune with where drumming was in 1990. And Painkiller, by the way, came out a month after Tear did. And the first song on the album, when you hear that opening to Painkiller, you're like, okay, you know, I mean, that gets you to
Yeah.
sit up on the edge of your seat. You're like, okay, this is a new Judas Priest thing we have going on here. And the problem with Cozy, as great of a drummer as he is that Cozy has a very big history and he brings some baggage himself with it. I mean, we're going to mention as we go through the songs that there's times where it reminds you of Rainbow, and Cozy is part of that. It might have helped if it was a younger guy with maybe his own unique personality. I remember hearing Scott Travis and being like, wow, who is this? I mean, it just jumped out right at me, his drumming all over that record. It was a real personality, a modern, you know, young guy. And even the sound of, you know, if we want to keep talking about Painkiller, Painkiller was a reset for Judas Priest coming off
Mhm.
of Turbo and Ram It Down. And it isn't like they did something completely different, like completely different stylistic change. It was almost like they just went back to their classic sound, but they modernized it. You listen to Glenn Tipton's playing on that record. It's obvious he sat down and was woodshedding to keep up with, to mod, like bring Judas Priest into the 90s, if you will. And maybe if Iommi had approached that like, I need a young drummer with a unique, strong personality. I need a bass player who's really going to jump out and really add something to this. And hey, we've got Tony Martin here. He's a great singer, and we're going to kind of do what with the way Dio brought Black Sabbath into the 80s. You know, Ronnie sort of brought Black Sabbath, modernized the Black Sabbath sound, took them out of the 70s. Maybe this would have been the time for them to say, okay, we're resetting here. I'm getting some really strong, fresh voices in here. In some ways, I think bringing in Cozy, it ties it to the past, and it doesn't allow it to kind of grow and be its own thing. I mean, not many bands are able to reset themselves. Judas Priest did it very well with Painkiller. Granted, Rob lands up leaving after that, but this is sort of the problem here when you have a band, and you mentioned earlier, you said, well, when a band comes down and it's just one original member. Well, if the band is Jethro Tull, love Jethro Tull, think all the players in Jethro Tull are great players they've had through the years. But let's face it, Ian Anderson is a big part of that sound. Ian Anderson writes all the music, he plays multiple instruments, blah, 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 blah. Black Sabbath was a different situation. We've talked about this. The original lineup, it really truly was uh, all of them together made that original Black Sabbath sound. The Mob Rules era of the band, Vinny Appice and Ronnie, it's a real combination of, you're mixing all these things together in a pot, and that's what's creating this. And when we get to this era of the band, we get a lot of things that, how much personality is Neil Murray really adding to the band?
Right.
We're getting this with on Eternal Idol. I love Bob Daisley, but you know, they're not really contributing a lot to maybe Bob does to a certain degree on Eternal Idol, but it's missing that element, and that also causes it to become very kind of generic. And we keep mentioning Whitesnake. You know, Whitesnake, he got rid of all John Sykes and those guys. Neil Murray actually wasn't Neil Murray originally on that Whitesnake album with John Sykes, and then he landed up just getting all these kind of guys that it was just all about David Coverdale. And it's Black Sabbath, as much as I love Tony Iommi and he's a big part of that sound, it's never been 100% just about Tony Iommi. It's always been about him and the people around him, the unique personalities, the way they interact with each other. That's what's always made Black Sabbath great. And even an album like Born Again, even though Ian Gillan only lasted for one record, it worked for me on that album. And here, when we get to this point, it works to a certain degree, but it also doesn't. And it causes them to, like we keep saying here, sound very like they could be any other band. Like any other band could have put out a record like this. I listen to Mob Rules and say, man, nobody could have put out only Black Sabbath could have made that record. Only Black Sabbath can make an album like Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. Only Ian Gillan and Black Sabbath can make an album that sounds like Born Again. Now we're kind of like, yeah, kind of, but it sort of, like we said, blends in with everybody else and starts to become a little bit generic, which is unfortunate because there are a lot of good songs on here. There are good things on here. It's just missing. I guess you need to put it this way. It's very hard to sort of put this in words, but it's just missing that extra X factor.
Yep, that's a good way to put it. And I think another thing that kind of diminishes some of what would otherwise be incredible, because there are some moments in some of these songs where you could hear that in more capable hands, and I don't mean as far as musical prowess, I mean as far as having more charisma, more personality. In more capable hands with regard to having more personality, I think it might have been a lot more effective. But you've got Tony Martin, who's a good singer. He's got a great voice, but he's not Dio. He doesn't take charge of the material. Tries. It's not for lack of trying, and you can hear him. He does. He tries to get a little bit of grit to his voice. But it just kind of ends up sounding very safe, kind of AOR-ish, and he's that kind of a singer. I think when he when he joined, he was sort of just following the template that Ray Gillan had laid down, Headless Cross. He asserted himself more, but he still kind of was a little uncomfortable, a little unsure of what he was supposed to do. So he wrote all these lyrics, and they were sort of cliche and they were cheesy. And then he sang them well, but it seemed like they were not really coming from the right place. Like it just seemed a little bit phony. And here he's writing his own lyrics again, and he's getting away from, maybe because there was some criticism with some of the cheesy lyrics, maybe that stuck in his mind, and he wanted to go in a different direction with the lyrics of Tears. So he, developed his concept, part of the album anyway, or this the Norse history, or whatever you want, Norse mythology. But he got away from more of the cliche, bats and vampires and crosses and Satan and devils and things like that. He got away from that, and he got into some new, more unique territory, or at least not totally unique to what other bands were doing, but unique as far as things that he had contributed before. Trying to develop more of a personality, maybe a little something that was a little bit more sincere for this record. But unfortunately, it just kind of falls into the boring category. I would almost, maybe, I'm hesitant to say, but I might almost prefer a song like Nightwing to some of the songs like Odin's Court, or
Yeah.
Feels Good to Me, even Devil and Daughter, which isn't a song that I'm really that crazy about on Headless Cross. I might prefer the lyrical approach of something like that, as opposed to the Lawmaker. But we're going to go from song to song like we always do. But my point is that we had too many guys that were safe, and unfortunately, it makes the entire album feel very safe and not very profound. And I think from my perspective, that's the whole thing in a nutshell for me. It's how I feel about this record. It's my attitude toward it. It's good. but it's just not great. It's not remarkable. It's not anything that I feel is a milestone in the legacy of Black Sabbath. I feel like it's just I don't know, stopping point. It's just a means to an end. It would eventually take us to another high point.
Yeah.
And at this point, that's kind of what we're doing. We're sort of treading water here in the
Yeah.
Black Sabbath
It,
timeline.
and you mentioned we talked about this, I'm pretty sure, with probably on the Eternal Idol. When Tony Martin comes into the band, he maybe because he doesn't have the experience that Dio had, he he certainly didn't have the experience level of experience that Ian Gillan had or Glenn Hughes had. All those singers were able to come in and they already had personalities. They were like character, they're who they were was already established, and they were able to come in and yeah, Ian Gillan tweaked it a
Yeah,
little bit, but he didn't. uh they all came in and they all had their thing. They were able to walk into the room, and because of their past credentials, they were able to walk in and be themselves. And unfortunately for Tony Martin, he comes in at Eternal Idol at the last second, so he just has to sing over Ray Gillen's parts. He's not able to really assert his own personality. Like you mentioned on Headless Cross, he sort of maybe played to the audience a little bit too much, or what he thought Black Sabbath lyrics in singing should be like. And here on Tier, I kind of feel like it's more himself. I always felt like this was kind of the Tony Martin album as far as him asserting his own personality. But yeah, by the time we've gotten to this point, and the fact that they would go back to Dio after this, these are all just little things, and when you add these things all together, this is what makes the album, like you said, good, maybe not great. But all right, shall we jump into the songs then?
sure.